Okay, a very good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our final session on floating offshore wind. I hope you've enjoyed the conference so far, but we thought we'd finish off with an insight into the floating offshore wind scenario. Some very encouraging words from the First Minister earlier this morning, or earlier this afternoon. I guess just to do a bit of scene setting, there are expected between 15 and 50 gigawatts of development potential for floating offshore wind around the coastline of the UK. And a significant part of that could very definitely be in the Celtic Sea region, that sort of area bounded by the south and west coast of Wales, the southeast coast of Ireland, and the northwest coast of Devon and Cornwall. The prospect of job creation, economic growth, around 29 to 30,000 jobs, a gross value added of some 40 billion, in excess of that figure. It's really a huge potential. The scale of the task is clearly enormous and requires really a coordinated response from the UK supply chain to look at the potential economic boom for the UK. But fundamentally, underneath that is, as the First Minister said this morning, energy security and that transition to an integrated energy system. So there's a huge amount to play for. And in this session this afternoon, what we'd like to do is explore some of the key issues in that on the leasing, on grid, on ports, and on the supply chain. And I'm joined by a very well-experienced panel in those contexts. And I'd like to introduce them to you, and then we'll set off and explore each of those challenges in turn for the next good hour or so, and obviously give you the opportunity, as we've done in the previous panel sessions, to give you the chance to ask your questions to our panel a little later on. So, first of all, Tim Stiven from the Crown Estate.
Hi, Martin. Thanks very much. Just let me say it's a pleasure to be with you today, and thank you, Martin, for the invitation to join you. As Martin says, my name is Tim Stiven. The short version of my introduction is that I am the sector lead for floating wind at the Crown Estate, and what that means in practical reality is that 95% of my time is occupied by the design of the leasing process and other supporting activities for our Celtic Sea floating wind programme, and I'll make some remarks about that and very happy to take your questions on that and other topics as we go by.
Thanks, Tim. We have representing the developer community now, supply chain manager Louise Thibierge from Blue Gem Wind. Louise.
Yeah, well done. It's the best pronunciation I ever got on that name, so well done that. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be among you today. So I work as supply chain manager for Blue Gem Wind. We're a joint venture between Simply Blue Energy, which is a marine energy developer in the Celtic Sea mainly, and Total Energies, who joined the joint venture in 2020. I originally come from that side of the business, used to work in France, based in Paris in offshore wind already. I worked originally on ScotWind type of project, so I was very excited to actually move to that kind of position, which was already very supply chain oriented. So floating wind, which comes with different kinds of challenge, but sure. Also very good focus on supply chain challenges.
And we'll explore some of those supply chain issues in this session. Simon Cheeseman from the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult, based down in Cornwall. Simon, closely involved in the development of the Celtic Sea cluster and the momentum behind that.
Yeah, thanks very much, Martin, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Simon Cheeseman from the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult. We're an independent, not-for-profit research organisation that looks at developing innovative technology to drive down the costs of offshore renewables. That's both fixed bottom wind, floating wind, and wave and tidal energy. So we're a national organisation, but we've got a number of regional offices. We've got an office in Pembroke, the Marine Energy Engineering Centre of Excellence, and then I run the regional office down in Cornwall. And it's a bit of a pincer movement where we're sort of looking at the Celtic Sea and helping to drive the strategy for accelerated development and deployment of offshore wind in the Celtic Sea.
Thanks, Simon. And also from Cornwall, Matt Hodson, Chief Operations Officer in Celtic Sea Power. Matt.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much for inviting me to the panel. And thank you for having me in Llandudno. It's my first time in Llandudno. Absolutely beautiful. I will be coming back. So thank you very much for that. Yeah, Celtic Sea Power is a wholly owned organisation in the public sector. We have a mission to maximise the economic benefit that comes from floating offshore wind in the Celtic Sea. And we're looking to do that by supporting strategic enabling actions, which really create the right environment for accelerated development, which create the right sort of environment for focused and quantified investment into infrastructure and supply chain, and really make sure that this fantastic opportunity is something that we as this part of the world have real ownership of, and we don't have it done to us, I think is probably a summary of what we're trying to achieve. We are based in Pembroke and also down Hale in Cornwall. So with a foot in both camps, we are dipping ourselves in the Celtic Sea. I won't say which bit. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt. Now, we had originally anticipated that Tamsin Dijkstra from Bays would be with us today, specifically to discuss her chief involvement on ports development and ports engagement. But unfortunately, Tamsin is a COVID casualty and hasn't been able to travel to be with us. But as a late substitute, delighted to welcome Jim Scopes. Again, Jim, welcome. Jim from local partnerships here in Wales has been also active in your work in terms of the ports development. So, Jim, welcome, and perhaps you could say a few words of intro.
Sure. Hello, and thank you. And apologies that this late substitute was also late onto this stage, so I hope I haven't kept you all waiting too long. So, Jim Scopes from Local Partnerships. We are supporting Jasper Roberts as the senior responsible owner for the Marine Energy Programme. And the Marine Energy Programme's raison d'etre is to maximise the benefits from marine energy for Wales. And one of the topic this afternoon, one of the key areas we're looking at is how do you enable the wonderful potential of the Celtic Sea area to actually be developed out. So I lead what we've called the Ports Infrastructure project, and exploring ways in which we might try and unlock that potential, and I'm sure that will come up as we talk around those key themes.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, what I'd like to do then is kick off with the first of those four topics that I mentioned, and let's start with leasing, Tim. The Crown Estate has made some very significant statements in its ambitions and opening the opportunities in the Celtic Sea. So perhaps you could outline the Crown Estate's approach to Celtic Sea leasing and what you anticipate.
Yeah, very happy to do that, Martin. So I think as I think about this, I sort of like to group my thoughts in sort of three topics. First is, as you said, to use your word, our ambition. The second thing is to think about how we build momentum, and I think that's an important word because speed is very important, but building and maintaining momentum is important too. And my third thought is around collaboration, because planning the use of the seabed and making it available in a way that is sort of positive for the market, but also positive for other users of the sea and environment is fundamentally a collaborative thing. And many of the decisions that we take will enable decisions that others need to take for a coherent outcome. So if I just sort of focus on those three things for a moment, I think in the sense of ambition, I think it's sort of well understood that we set out a position paper last November And we increased our ambition to in the Celtic Sea to bring forward 4 gigawatts of project capacity, with a view that those should be delivered in a time frame 2030 to 2035. So that's in operation and functioning in that window. To perhaps presage a question which I suspect will come about, how does the ScotWind outcome affect that? Clearly, the ScotWind outcome is very welcome for the UK. It's a very positive build on the very strong UK market and pipeline opportunity, and it does cause us to reflect. And we're doing some more analysis to understand the longer-term potential of the Celtic Sea, which I hope will communicate in due course to provide more clarity for the market. But the other thing I wanted to dwell on is that when the ScotWind process closed, we reopened a market engagement which we'd executed before Christmas last year, and gave our community of developers an opportunity, and I can see Andronikos nodding at me there, the opportunity to update their views about the Celtic Sea as a result of the ScotWind outcome. And I think the very pleasing thing for me was to see that there remains very strong developer appetite for floating wind in the Celtic Sea. It's seen as an attractive and competitive market. And so I think we go forward with confidence that we have a very engaged set of developers and a strong market opportunity. And we'll do our best to frame it in a way that makes it an attractive offer. But I think that feedback from the market is important for me to share to sustain confidence in that outcome. So then the next thing I want to touch on in relation to momentum is that you know, we have to bear in mind that if we look around the world, there's sort of 150 odd megawatts of floating wind in operation at the moment, and the numbers are getting very big very quickly, and that's appropriate because the scale of the challenge and the opportunity is huge. But I don't want to lose sight of our portfolio of test and demonstration projects in the Celtic Sea. So Blue Gem Wind have the Erebus project, which has an agreement for lease for us and is progressing through its design and consenting. And then we have 3 further projects, 2 by Floventis and 1 by Flotation Energy. And then, of course, we recently enabled the change of use of the Wave Hub site in Cornwall to be exploited for floating wind. So that gives us a starting point of perhaps sort of 450 megawatts of floating wind, which could be delivered before 2030. Which might sound small in the context of the future market numbers, but I think is an absolutely crucial learning opportunity for the market and for the region. And Jim and I have sort of many discussions on this and other topics around port infrastructure, but those sort of learning opportunities I think are essential, and some of the technologies that could come forward in those projects I think present good opportunity for the regional supply chain. So I think that's a key part of building momentum. And picking up pace, but most importantly, a key mechanism for the region to get engaged with those projects and for us to learn and for others to learn how to deliver at pace, at scale in the future. So then, what else are we doing to support the momentum of the market? I think 2 things are important. Firstly, we're sort of taking in lessons from our prior leasing activities, and we're adapting the way that we manage our habitat regulations assessment. So in the Celtic Sea, for the first time, we're putting that process ahead of the tender. We're using that as an opportunity to refine and improve our spatial design, and we believe we'll save significant time in doing that and produce or bring forward sites that are better understood from a risk perspective. So that's us seeking to develop momentum. And then lastly, we are minded to commission a program of pre-consent surveys that would acquire engineering and environmental data, and sharing that with the market that would take time and activity out of their critical path as well. So enabling it both through the structure of our leasing and enabling actions which we sit alongside our leasing, we're seeking to build momentum and pick up pace.
Do you think that, bearing in mind comments that we've heard from First Minister, for example, this morning, if you like, trying to defossilise, if that's a word, the energy system. And you talked about momentum there. Do you think that there is the opportunity to accelerate beyond that 450 megawatts by 2030? Or do you think it's steady as she goes, let's de-risk it, be sure that we can do it, or can we do better? Or can we go faster?
So I think we need to do a bit more work to understand whether there are opportunities to bring other projects forward earlier. I think that the best I can say at the moment is that sort of setting the foundations for sort of acceleration. So, you know, getting the structure of the HRA right, bringing forward projects that hopefully carry a little bit less consenting risk because of that, delivering some data into the market that takes that activity out of the critical path. And we have views to share and sort of remarks to make about port and supply chain infrastructure. So I think actually acceleration comes from building the right foundations, and then you can look at whether the projects can come to market quicker. But if you build in the right foundations, then you create opportunity for the projects to come through quicker, which I think is a better approach than just sort of trying to force the projects through quicker, but without having the fundamentals in place. So, so a lot of our focus, Martin, and what sort of we would encourage, you know, and sort of seek collaboration with others to do, build the fundamentals, build the foundations, and then we can pick up the pace.
Martin, could I?
Yes, Jim.
I think the interesting thing is that, so by 2030, if you've got more or less 500 megawatts, that the target then for the first 5 years of the next decade is another 3.5 gigawatts actually in the Celtic Sea. So there's a massive acceleration thereafter. I think trying to get the sort of infrastructure that is going to be needed to achieve the throughput through the ports, so it almost becomes like a manufacturing type process in terms of something that you know is churning out 3, 4, 5 more platforms per month from each port. I think that will take a little bit of time to put in place, and in the meantime we can learn from the experience of some of these test and demonstration projects. So I think the sorts of conversations we're having with the ports is not losing sight of the test and demonstration, absolutely not, but if we really want to be ambitious about this, we need to build some pretty damn big infrastructure to cope with it.
I just want to briefly check. Are we speaking loudly enough for you at the back to hear? It's okay?
Good.
Okay, thank you. I was just conscious that if we're sort of almost at conversation level here, and I just wanted to be sure that you could hear what we were saying. Okay, thank you. So coming back to you, Tim.
Yeah.
And yesterday in my introductory remarks, I talked about this balance between between the user interests and the conservation and protection of the environment interests, and ensuring that we get that balance absolutely right to protect the environment, but to deliver those objectives which we can see.
Yep.
And in the context of your work in the Crown Estate, of course, the habitats regulations assessments are a big part of that. What do you see that they will entail? And will they be timely enough to support the project developers and their interests in getting this thing going as quickly as they can?
So, we should talk about habitat regulations, but it's not the only thing that matters in relation to the environment.
Of course not.
And I'll make some remarks on that as well. But in relation to the habitat regulations assessment, we have a statutory duty and obligation to assess the impacts of our plans on protected habitats at the plan level. The purpose behind us updating our approach to it is that it runs ahead of the tender. What that does is it allows us to run our spatial design, i.e. which areas should we bring forward for development, in parallel with the stakeholder consultation that's entailed by the habitat regulations assessment, so that those two processes are in strong dialogue with each other. So as we propose areas for development, the process of the habitat regulations assessment brings that expert stakeholder feedback and the data and the evidence that supports that and fully informs that spatial design. And the intent, and we can't yet say we'll deliver it because we're not at the end of the process, but the intent of that is to deliver to market locations for project development that are more sensitive to the natural environment and the needs of, the needs of the species that live in those habitats. So that's its purpose. The other thing I wanted to mention is obviously not all environmental issues are captured in the HRA. We completed in February a market and stakeholder engagement about our spatial design. We had 40 market participants, 70 stakeholders, not just from the environment, from navigation and from ports and from other fishing and from other users of the sea. And that was a very technical process that then informed the criteria and the way that, and the priority and weighting of criteria that we put into our sort of GIS models that then informs the starting point of which areas should be put into the HRA process and could result. So at every stage of the Crown Estate process, there's a very strong engagement with a group of stakeholders to represent all of those alternative interests. I think we're convinced, absolutely convinced, that we have to decarbonise the energy system, but we have to make sure that we protect and enhance the natural environment, because there's no point getting to net zero with an environment that's trashed.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a key point. And I think I'm sure that your engagement with the electricity system operator is also a key one, and perhaps we can come back to that when we move into the grid discussion. But before we just leave this topic temporarily, I'm just going to pick up a question that's on Slido here, which is directly relevant to the Crown Estate.
Yep.
And it does have a political element to it. The question being, what is your opinion on devolving the Crown Estate to Wales? Why is it better to keep the status quo? Why should you not devolve in the same way Crown Estate Scotland has to Scotland, the seabed and leasing arrangements around the Welsh coast to Wales? Sorry if that's a political question.
All right. No, that's fine. So I'll give you an answer in two bits. One is political and one perhaps is a little bit less. So I think the first answer to that question is that the Crown Estate is an independent body, independent of ministerial controls, and so those discussions and those considerations are matters for governments and for elected bodies, appropriately so. I think if we look at the status quo, some of the advantages of that are that the job of developing a net zero energy system for the UK in a way that enhances and protects our natural environment is an extremely complex one, and I think benefits from coherent thinking through the widest geography we can. And secondly, I observe that in general, international investors and markets favour coherent market structures and large markets, and therefore I think there are some benefits to the structure we have at the moment. And I know that speaking personally and colleagues at the Crown Estate feel very, very committed to successful outcomes across the UK, and we work very hard. I'm mindful of the comments the First Minister made at lunchtime about the nation of Wales working in partnership and valuing the partnership with the Crown Estate. Certainly we work very hard. I can see colleagues in the room from the Welsh Government, and we work hard on building those effective working relationships, and I hope some of the evidence of that will come out in the topics we're talking about today, like how do we get grid right, how do we develop that critical port infrastructure, how do we develop a portfolio of projects that provides sort of opportunity and incentive for long-term investment.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim. All right, let's move on then to that second topic on ports. And clearly, I think the word industrialisation is a word that we've used in the circle of Celtic Sea conversations so far, in terms of how we can build the industry around the supply chain to back up the delivery, and that industrialisation, and one really major element of it is clearly port infrastructure. And it's obviously desirable to try to create those facilities or to build on the facilities that we already have in the west coast of the UK to support that ambition. So Jim, coming to your work in local partnerships and your ports work, how do you see that developing? I mean, the Welsh Government has recently commissioned and delivered a port study. There's still a lot of work going on. Where do you see this developing now?
Well, I mean, I suppose the good news is that we haven't been sitting on our hands for the last several months in terms of, so it's already started. And I think I very much support what Tim said around collaboration. So what we have been trying to do on the Marine Energy Programme is talk to the ports, plural, particularly for floating offshore wind, those on the south and southwest coast, about given the size of the prize, given the scale of what needs to be delivered, does it make most sense to have a collaborative approach to actually maximising the throughput that I mentioned earlier in terms of the number of devices, platforms that you can get developed in any weather window, during the usable year, and that's been going well. We've been having some very constructive discussions. I think we've also got one eye very much on the fact that, and I'm sure Tamsin would have been quizzed about this if she'd been here, we're calling it the FLOW MISS, so OMISS 2 funding that's available, 160 million that BEIS have said will be available to support Scotland and Wales in developing out floating offshore wind opportunities. A big chunk of that, we understand, nothing's been confirmed yet, will be for ports infrastructure. There'll be some for manufacturing as well. But we also believe that BEIS are looking for end-to-end solutions. And we think those end-to-end solutions might require a multi-port approach. So we're exploring whether that would be acceptable, and how do we get our crudely here, how do we get our hands on as much of that cash as we can for Wales in order to be able to develop the ports out. So that work has started, but I think I mentioned yesterday when I was doing the session in the afternoon that this is a systemic issue. So there's not going to be one thing that's going to solve all of this. You need to try and keep the other bits of the system. It's not a silver bullet. So the ports are absolutely fundamental. If they're not in place, you won't attract the manufacturing. But even if they are in place, you then have to make sure that the supply chain is there in order to be able to support it. And so we're beginning to turn our minds to, okay, so how do you also, in tandem, try and understand how you develop out those supply chain opportunities, because that is what's going to really make the ports want to invest. There's going to be quite big bucks that need to be invested in this. So the ports are going to have to make that case to their boards, and the board wants to see that long-term pipeline, sticky manufacturers, hopefully, who are around the hinterland of the ports, and you're able to develop out those platforms. So I think that what we're trying to do is to take that sort of collaboration piece forward. And I think I'd also want to echo something else that Tim said, so it popped out of my mind for a moment, was this idea of momentum and ambition. I think, so what next after the 4 gigawatts? Okay, we don't know how we're going to deliver that yet, but assuming we manage to solve that problem, part of what the boards of the ports are going to be asking is okay, well, it only takes us out to 2035. Some of this infrastructure could be there for 120 years. So how where next after that, and how do we justify the investment? So we're trying to understand that too.
Okay, Jim, thanks. Louise, from a developer's perspective, from Blue Gem Wind, of course, in the Celtic Sea, you're involved in a pioneering project. It's the 100 megawatt project, and we understand that within your organisation, you have been doing a lot of work on port analysis. Where do you see things at the moment? How do you see things developing?
Maybe in order to zoom out a little bit and look at why port is so important for floating wind. So with our test and demo project Erebus, which is 100 meg, we've learned how it's so critical to have ports in place in Wales. And basically for any floating technology or projects, ports are important for three things. So I think we all saw the turbine site on the horizon just outside the venue. Imagine that size of turbine, even bigger, but not on bottom fixed structure, but on 80 meters wide floating platforms. That changes dramatically the way that you install those. At the moment, we don't know how to install that at sea directly. So the construction philosophy that we're looking at for our project Erebus, but also for project Varus, which is 300 meg, and probably down the road for commercial projects as well, is to perform the installation at the port infrastructure rather than at sea. And when we say construction, what it encompasses is the final assembly of the floater. So in our case on Erebus, we have 7 floating structures, which are semi-submersible, which really roughly consist into 3 columns that are attached together, and the wind turbine is sitting on one of the main columns. So the fine assembly of this requires really large infrastructure. So imagine something 80 meters wide, 30 meters high, several thousands of tons per structure. You need to assemble them somewhere, load them off a quay, stick them to quayside, and then perform the assembly of a turbine on top of that. So there's assembly of the floater, integration of the turbine, and also, of course, the O&M. And when we say operation and maintenance, there's the scheduled and daily operations, but there's also the major components replacement that will occur once in a while. So looking at, we knew quite early on that the type of infrastructure that we would require would be massive. So in terms of quayside, it means the really hundreds of meters available quayside with really high load-bearing capacity from 10 to 50 tons per square meter, depending on whether you're just storing some material or if you're actually sitting a crane that would integrate the turbine. We also require deep water, not only near the quayside, but 100 meters away to accommodate the entire structure. And so we knew quite early on that we would not get that on the shelf, if I mean, in the Celtic Sea. So we made this assessment a year ago already, and so from there, in order to make the project work, we had to become a little bit more creative. So there are a couple ways that we're trying to go over this challenge. The first one is planning, of course, and so there was a lot of engagement done with the port to check whether they had any plan of upgrades, and whether that would come in time for Erebus, which is going to be built in 2025, 2026, so the short answer is probably not. So if with that answer into account, then we can look at more temporary ways of performing that kind of works at the port, instead of considering the quayside and an onshore crane for the integration. Maybe we need to consider a jackup vessel in sheltered waters rather than at sea, but still in the vicinity of the port, which has the benefit of training the port to that kind of logistics and also leaving a legacy on the seabed. And the last thing as well is to consider separating all those works. So ideally, it's really good to have the assembly of the floater and the integration in the turbine on the same location, because that minimizes the kind of logistics you would have otherwise. But if you're considering smaller infrastructures, then you need to consider that maybe you'll perform assembly on one location, then tow the floater somewhere else, perform the integration of turbine, and then tow everything directly to the site. So there's proximity to the final site, which in all cases is off the coast of Pembrokeshire, which is absolutely crucial. So looking at the immediate vicinity has always been the preferred option in terms of times of travel. And currently we're looking at all of those solutions and way around infrastructure. We're very conscious that we're not going to get like a fully built up infrastructure by the time we build Erebus. There's still a bit work to do, but in order to get prepared for CFD next year and then final investment decision, I believe we'll land on decision quite soon, hope.
And that's interesting. I mean, because you are faced with that pressure of time in terms of the delivery of the project. But it goes back to what you were saying there, Jim, about building out and getting ready for that next step, that next scale. Exactly. And Matt, Matt, you of course have also done quite a lot of work in this respect in the southwest of England in looking at this.
We have, working with Jim actually, fairly closely on this, and I think it's probably worth, in terms of inculcating a sense of urgency and concern. This isn't a question of either or here. I think what we've heard is that it's crucial to have facilities close to site to make these projects work. I think what we're also hearing is, for the stepping stone projects, it's a challenge to kind of to get to that point where we can make it work. So put ourselves into the future where and let's work on the 4 gigawatt ambition for a moment. That's a turbine production rate of a turbine every week and a half for 6 years.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers are enormous. I mean, 4 gigawatts is 280, 300 platforms and turbines.
It's a scary number. It's a scary. Well, it's not. It's an exciting. It's an exciting number. Sorry, scary. But scary because it's not. I think we're all part of the Celtic Sea bubble. We live and breathe it. But we're not the only show in town, and obviously. There's a huge amount of activity scheduled to happen not very far from here to the north in the same sort of period. We've got what's happening in the Irish in Republic sector as well. There's gigawatts of ambition there. And in France, there's obviously the fixed wind, which is being built as we speak, and then another 750 megawatts of floating offshore wind being tendered right now with an aspiration of 40 gigawatts. So there isn't many other. There is going to be a capacity crunch in ports in Europe. That's something we need to be aware of. What do we need to do to overcome it? I think it's collective improvement in all of our port infrastructure. But for that to happen, we need to know, we need to target and focus on what that needs to be, thinking about the future industry, and also accept that there is a gap. There is a gap between ambition and aspiration and development expenditure from developers right now, and contracts being let, which presents a problem for boards of ports and their investment plan, because they don't have any contractual certainty really until projects hit FID, which makes it quite difficult to front load the investment on a private sector investment into a port. You could spend a lot of money getting a port ready for an industry which might not arrive. That's the point.
Yeah.
So how we overcome that actually is the interesting conundrum for the day. Is that fair?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Just the scale. Yeah. I think it's just highlighted the scale. Did you want to say?
If I can just build on that, I think what we're facing right now is a big challenge. It's just because we're doing it for the first time, really, and this focus around the final investment decision is really something critical to understand. So from a developer perspective, we're trying to de-risk all the supply chain as much as possible to go to FID with a contract structure that works, and that we're going to show to bankers, basically, that are going to invest in the project with a certain level of risk, and it's exactly the same for ports as well. What we're seeing, we've also looked at other ports that are more ready in Europe, and what we're finding is that once you have this baseline of infrastructure that is ready, you still need to be conscious that you'll make some upgrades on a project-per-project basis, but those are very, I would say, tailored and tweaks rather than major upgrades. And so you're no longer considering hundreds of millions, but maybe just a few ones. And you're not talking about months and months or years of works, but maybe just 6 months. You're past your consenting stage because the whole area is consented already. So if you have this kind of timelines and this kind of budget, then as a developer you can go to FID, and from FID to construction you still have time in your program to accommodate for, let's say, 3, 4, 5 months work. Whereas here, for the ports in the Celtic Sea, if you're the first mover and you have 2 or 3 years of work down the road, you need to take that commitment 1 or 2 years before FID, and this is what makes it so complicated. It's not something that developers can solve on their own, especially with our footprint right now. Erebus is just 7 platforms. Valorous is going to be triple that side, and it's going to be a number of other projects very soon. So it really comes down to making the first move of investing in the infrastructure, and really from developer perspective, we would go anywhere where the infrastructure is ready. It's just a no-brainer that we want to get closer to sites.
Okay.
We also need to bear in mind as well, talking about this from a systems approach, that and I noticed that someone mentioned consenting on the panel there.
Yeah.
If we're going to develop and build new infrastructure or improve on infrastructure in ports, there is a consenting risk associated with that, which is going to, as at the moment, is probably separate to and not linked to the cumulative impacts of offshore wind. So I don't want to throw that hand grenade in at this stage as well.
Not yet. We haven't got that yet.
I just have.
Just hold your fire. I'd like to segue then from ports into what's behind that as well, the bigger supply chain. And Simon, of course, in the Catapult, providing the Secretariat services to the Celtic Sea Cluster Board and its development programme. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how it's going to support this wider ambition?
Yeah, absolutely, Martin. And IT guys, can I have my slide up, please? I've got just one slide that shows you the sort of construct of the Celtic Sea Cluster. There we go. Hope you can read that at the back. Also, those of you that visited the stand, have seen this brochure, which is all about the Celtic Sea Cluster. I'd encourage you to go on the website and have a look at that. But, on this panel now, we've had a really informed discussion already. There are lots of topics that feel quite familiar to us now, and issues that, we've been sort of kicking around for quite some time. But if you cast your mind back 2 years, we were in a very different space then. I think it was round about then that the Catapult published its macroeconomic report on the benefits of floating offshore wind for the UK, and that sort of put the spotlight on Scotland, but also on the Celtic Sea, probably for the first time. And at that point, there wasn't a CFD available for floating offshore wind. At that point, with respect, Tim, I don't think the Crown Estates were really looking at the Celtic Sea as a sort of market then. I remember going to sort of smaller conferences with Matt and sort of having these fairly bullish discussions about the opportunities in the Celtic Sea, and having to put forward some quite strong persuasive arguments, and people didn't really get it. So forming the cluster was really sort of a sort of long-term visionary piece by the organisations that are listed there. So it was formed by Welsh Government, the Cornwall Local Enterprise Partnership, Marine Energy Wales, Celtic Sea Power, that's part of Matt's organisation, and then the Catapult as a national organisation that has the lens on the sort of national perspective and is trying to get that balance right for UK PLC. So, immediately we saw that sort of those market barriers to rapid deployment in the Celtic Sea. At the time, there was no CFD. You know, there were discussions about, you know, the time for leasing rounds and how could that be accelerated. There are issues around grid that were all apparent then. And then there's a question of supply chain. And from a Catapult perspective, we're very much working with the Offshore Wind Industry Council and looking at that sector deal that the offshore wind industry signed with the UK government to try and increase UK content up from around 40%, you know, what we were seeing on the east of England in fixed bottom offshore wind, up to around 60%, and thinking how we were going to do that and looking at the supply chain, particularly in Wales and the southwest. There's predominantly very small companies, you know, SMEs that perhaps haven't got the balance sheet or the experience or the knowledge to be able to bid into some of these expected procurement rounds. You know, what are the standards they have to adhere to? You know, what is the real opportunity there? What's the timeline that's going to come along? So a lot of that work and some of the, you know, the knowledge that we've developed now to understand what that pipeline could look like and also what some of those, you know, more intricate barriers are, have come out of the analysis that the cluster's been working on. And the key thing about the cluster is it's there to develop really that sort of coordinated regional strategy for both sides of the Bristol Channel there, so that we can make the most of this massive opportunity that I think we're still trying to get our heads around, really, in terms of you know, what we need to do. You know, we talk about ports investment, but you know, ports aren't used to working in this way in terms of having to plan for sort of jam tomorrow. You know, we're looking at grid infrastructure in a pretty creaky national grid system with only a limited amount of viable entry points. So we're having to develop a more robust sort of grid strategy. So those are the sort of things we're working on, as well as looking at the intricacies of the supply chain and how can we get the ports, which are really the key to unlocking the rest of the supply chain, how can we get them motivated and on that same journey to actually make this happen. So the regional strategy will come out from the cluster fairly soon. And I think we've got at the moment, when you look at all the clusters around the UK, and clusters came out from the sector deal, I think this cluster is pretty unique in the way that it's been founded, you know, effectively by, we use the term quangos, but you know, we've got a vested interest in making this work, and we're here to be the glue to pull this together. We're not necessarily the organisations that need to be at the forefront of the cluster long term. That's probably a place for the councils, for the local enterprise partnerships, who are the ones that would need to mobilise their economic development teams to be able to make this work and to be able to release funding at a regional level to be able to support supply chain development. But having a coordinated single regional strategy that then Wales can develop its own regional plan on and the South West can develop its plan is really, really vital for what we're trying to achieve. And then that cluster then becomes, it's not the only voice, but it is trying to be that coordinated voice that then liaises with the Celtic Sea Developers Alliance, and the cluster is supported by the Crown States, their associate member, and we're fortunate enough that BEIS are also part of the cluster in an observer role as well. So we're pulling together all the main regulators and the supply chain, the ports, the developers, to all have these sort of conversations to get us all in the same room to be able to drive forward our collective plans to make this happen.
And I think that point about collaboration again was endorsed by the First Minister this morning. Clear evidence in his description and reference to his meeting with the leader of Cornwall Council, and it was one of his key strategic partnership and collaborative relationships to be developed. But sticking with supply chain, Louise, again, we've talked about your work in grid, and again, as a pioneering project, you've got to try to get the supply chain geared up for the delivery in your relatively short timescales. Mm-hmm. How are you doing with that? What progress are you making?
I've got a long answer to that.
Oh, have you?
So basically just trying to tidy up things. I would say that mainly 3 things that we need to do as a developer of emerging technology and supply chain. And by order of magnitude, the first one is removing the really big risks to the project. So this can be port infrastructure, for example, which is actually crucial to the delivery, but really floating is a new technology, so there are a number of areas across the project and the bill of materials where we're using new technologies. Some of them have never been designed. We are designing things that need to sustain incredible loads, incredible mid-ocean conditions, and we need to engage consistently with the supply chain to make sure that they're actually going to be able to build this. So just to give a few examples, for example, on the cable section, there's going to be a dynamic section to the cable that is going to float off from the turbine and then going to be grounded. And there's a lot of new accessories that are not available on the shelf at all, that have not been certified yet or tested. And we're designing those jointly with the inputs of the supply chain that says, you can design this, we're going to certify this in that year, so you can make reasonable plans. We're doing that. Probably one of the most important work in that area is the interface between the wind turbines and the floater. And at Blue Gem Wind, we took the decision some while ago to secure a floater concept first that had some track record and experience to make sure that at least this piece of the project was reasonable and was about to work, and then later bring on the turbine manufacturer, manage the interface. I would say that the second level is every other part of the project, which is more standard in that every other project has not only emerging technologies, but the work in the supply chain consists in de-risking the execution strategy and plan in terms of program and also costs. So that part of the work is very, I would say, standard. It consists in cookie cutting your packages with the right interfaces, not creating additional risks in unreasonable interfaces, and then going to the market and tendering those works. And we have actually started to do that for Erebus with a view to prepare for the CFD round next year. So we are closing our first round of pre-qualification, and we're going to move to ITT later this year. And the last bit of work is how do we bring on subcontracts and sub-packages, once you have chosen your main contractors, how do you make sure that there's going to be actually a local benefit, that you're going to strengthen the local supply chain? And we're very keen to do that, especially because we have a portfolio and there's another project coming down the line. So there are two ways to do that. There's the top-down way, I would say, and it consists in passing your requirements to the main contractors, and we're still in the process of polishing those requirements and indicating the right levels of local engagement that we need, what kind of local companies you want to see, in which area, etc. So we're devolving the responsibility on the main contractors to deliver those expectations. And this work is very iterative, because on floating wind, there's no standard way of doing things just yet. So we actually need to come up with our own targets, our own numbers, and find what's reasonable to expect from supply chain. So that's the top-down approach, and the bottom-up approach consists in, well, basically talking to the local companies, however small they are, in order to have a really good understanding of what can be done locally, and in order to challenge what the main contractors are going to offer, and have this kind of coordination with everyone. So on a daily basis, a lot of engagement, sharing the specifications of project, checking if the deliverables fit in the infrastructure, basically.
Okay. I mean, it's clear that supply chain development is actually quite a complex subject. And it's not just about lining up a whole list of contractors to bid in a project. There's a lot more to it under that. And I guess that there are other industries who have well experienced and developed complex supply chain mapping processes, procedures, and no doubt that we can learn from those as well as we take our industry forward. I'm conscious that time is moving on, and I'd like to move to the fourth of our topics here, and specifically grid. So, Matt, we're obviously aware that the offshore transmission network review has been taking place and is ongoing. Again, Welsh Government have done work and are doing work. So, what do you see? And from Cornwall, I'm aware too that Cornwall has been looking at the grid infrastructure. How do you see the grid story playing out at the moment?
Well, I think it's probably worth just reflecting on the reason why there is an OTNR, which is the Offshore Transmission Network Review, because I think that's quite important. And forgive me if I make this sound too simple. I'm quite a simple person, but if we look at how offshore wind on the east coast and the North Sea developed, it developed in a relatively sort of organic way. Projects were developed in round 1, then round 2 and round 3. And we had a system of apply and connect. So you develop your wind farm, you apply for a grid connection, and if there's capacity, you get your connection in, and you build your infrastructure, and then that infrastructure is auctioned off to an OFTO who then manages it, which has worked, to be fair, to get us to this point. But what we see now on the East Coast is the problem of cumulative impact. So we have a creaking capacity issue on the East Coast, and vehement local opposition to the roads being dug up again and again and again. And that's become a major bottleneck for wind farms that are currently being built on the East Coast. So you factor into that the amount of capacity that's been leased in ScotWind, and then looking at how do we get that connected, and how does that then come down and meet the demand centres. There is clearly clearly was a need to kind of really have a good review of that offshore transmission scenario. Firstly, to get over the bottlenecks which exist right now, which is the first part of the OTNR. How do we get those projects that are currently being built, that have been delayed, how do we find a way to make that work? But then at the same time, develop what is known as the enduring regime to last from 2030 on. So what does the future look like from that perspective? This part of the world, or certainly the Celtic Sea part of the world, is in essence more of a blank canvas. We don't have lots of existing infrastructure offshore. So as we start to connect, we have an opportunity to think far more strategically about what that offshore transmission looks like. We have to sort of also mention that's for sort of South Wales and the Celtic Sea and Cornwall in the South West. Obviously, here in North Wales it's a different circuit, and there are issues there. And I'm not going to touch on that, because there are probably people in this room who know far more about that than I do. But yeah, so we do have an opportunity to be more strategic when we think about offshore connection. We can't, to do what has clearly led to bottlenecks and constraints on the East Coast, to just do the same with point-to-point connections in the Celtic Sea, when we know that we are aiming to build out at least 4 gigawatts, would not be a great idea. So I think that's where we are at the moment. I think we're in a collective position of understanding that we have to collaborate, and we have to think about grid connections in a strategic way, and we need to consider it within the round of the system. So when we think about grid, offshore grid, different ways of doing things, that has to be considered in parallel with port infrastructure, which has to be developed in parallel with offshore wind development. So it's, yeah, a great opportunity to bring it together and look at it from a system.
And Tim, coming back to you on this, sort of the grid enabler is a key part of your assessment too, I believe.
Yeah, it is. And so just to build on what Matt says, I think what we observe from the Crown Estate is, the Celtic Sea is a new geography for sort of large-scale offshore renewable energy infrastructure. It's a sensitive natural environment, a precious natural environment, and the communities that surround it, don't derive all of their income from large engineering works and infrastructure. So we must be very sensitive to that. And so for that and other reasons, the Crown Estate very strongly supports a coordinated approach to grid in the Celtic Sea to reduce the impact on communities and reduce the impact on environment. But just to sort of, I think, focus on what does success look like here. And, the Crown Estate can help set the foundations for success, but can't do everything. But let's look at timing. We said in our position paper last November that we would look to sort of launch the tender for our rights in mid-2023, and if sort of putting ourselves in the developer's shoes for a minute, what they will want at that stage is clarity on the regulatory situation, clarity on the commercial model for coordinated grid, and some clarity about what the technical solution might look like, because they have to understand how that risk envelope fits within their wider approach to development, and that will inform how they sort of participate in our tender. So to support, I think the key things there are really the sort of regulatory piece and the commercial piece, and that sits with sort of Bays and Ofgem as much as anything else. But what we have done is work very closely with the energy system operator, and in fact we've signed a letter of intent with ESO, the Crown Estate and Crown Estate Scotland to collaborate on coordinated grid solutions. The Celtic Sea does look like a great opportunity to make a sort of, a breakthrough. Our planning assumptions of 1 gigawatt by 2030 and 4 gigawatts beyond that have, through that letter, or the collaboration that's built on that letter of intent, have gone into the ESO's holistic network design. And the market should start to see some of the results of that holistic network design come out later in the year, and then hopefully, as OTNR progresses, we'll start to get greater clarity on what the regulatory solution should look like. But I think, commercial needs, commercial solution, a regulatory context, and some kind of view on the technical solution. All of that needs to be in place sometime next year to allow the opportunity for coordination to continue. It will take more than that to land it, but for me that looks like sort of success in the Celtic Sea.
Yeah. And Louise, again, I guess in your work at this stage, to paraphrase in, I guess your approach is doing it the old way at the moment, because there is no choice. How have you found that stakeholder engagement on the grid network and grid connection that you need?
On the grid, so we've been focused on connected at Pembroke, and we've worked on that already in the past years. We've secured a grid connection for Erebus a while ago now, and that was before the start of reviewing the grid system regulation, etc. So we still knew very well at the time what kind of cards we're playing with, what was the business model down the line, etc. So actually it was, I would say, business as usual here for a developer in terms of identifying your point of connection, then your cable routes, engaging with the stakeholders to inform what the routes could cross their lands, etc. This process is potentially changing the way that things are going to be done on grid, and whether we need to collaborate with other developers. So here I want to speak with the same voice in terms of clarity and visibility. knowing for sure where your grid connection is going to be and when it's going to be available and what kind of risk comes with that. It's so important to know early in the process because it has an impact on all of your planning, on your consent applications, if you assume that developers are responsible for that for the cable route, which is the case, and even potentially in site selection and appreciation of distance to grid.
You said something very interesting about collaborating with other developers. And do you feel that there is that impetus, that willingness to get that level of cooperation and collaboration on issues like this? Are you seeing that?
I think it's a difficult thing to implement at the moment. I mean, not out of lack of willingness, of good faith, but the way that regulation is done at the moment, each developer is responsible for their grid connection, the development. There's a cost competitiveness element of it that has an impact on the cost of the project. Then each project enters a really wild competition to secure a CFD. So there's all these parameters that play against this cooperation appetite, but I think that would be easily removed with some clarity on regulation, etc.
But what I can offer there, I think, and you're clearly a part of this anyway, is that as part of our work as MEW, we're again providing the Secretariat services for the Celtic Sea Developers Association. I think we have 18 project developers represented in that group now. So it is a collective to try to overcome issues like this. So I think we have a vehicle there. And as we have with the Celtic Sea cluster, looking at the sort of the supply chain and the industrialisation, I think I feel that the vehicles are there to get the momentum going. You know, coming back to your building momentum point, Tim, and this industrialisation to overcome these huge challenges. Okay, I think it's time to perhaps address a couple of the questions that have come through. And the one here about supply chain and local content, and in some respects I think we've touched on this because the scale is so significant. But the question is, should there be a target for local content in the Celtic Sea and its projects? And how could developers be held to this through the Crown Estate lease, or the CFD, or other means? Who'd like to start on that one? Supply chain.
Happy to kick that one off if that's all right.
Yeah, yes, Matt.
Martin, I would suggest there is a target already, and it's 60%, which is what the Offshore Wind Industry Council have undertaken to deliver as part of the sector deal.
So that's the onus on developers.
The onus is on the developers there. However, I think it's not quite as easy as that. I think I think that we've got to be realistic. My view is that if we genuinely want to maximise the benefits to this region, we need to be really bold and really ambitious about what we consider that we can do locally. I don't think we should be content with trickle down. I don't think we should be aiming to be a nation of tier 3, tier 2 contractors. I think we need to be bold, ambitious, and be prepared to sort of work out how we are able to deliver, be the prime contractors, to be the tier 1s, to really form an integral part of the industrial ecosystem which floating offshore wind needs to be to deliver to this region. I think we've also got to be mindful that specifying local content is difficult to do within the context of trading relationships with other countries. It's not something which you're supposed to do under WTO rules. But what you can do is focus on carbon. So we've done some really interesting modelling through one of the projects we're running in Cornwall, which looks at the carbon intensity of some virtual operations, to be fair. But when you compare a regionalised solution for installation of floating offshore wind with what could be considered the status quo global solution, so fabrication in the Far East, assembly in the Low Countries, and then operations from France, the carbon intensity doubles for that entire operation. And I think if we want to build a truly sustainable net zero low carbon industry, we shouldn't be exporting our carbon elsewhere. That doesn't help the planet, it doesn't help us. And actually, that drives us towards more regional, more local solutions. And so, how do we go back to getting that 60% local content? Let's focus on developing those low carbon footprint operations. I also think that we need to step up to the plate. I don't think just saying you have to use local content necessarily is going to guarantee quality, and it's not necessarily going to guarantee standards, it's not going to guarantee cost effectiveness. We have to step up and be prepared to offer cost effective, high quality, good standard operations, so that the developers are getting the best deal.
And innovative solutions as well, because that's the point that you made. You don't know how you're going to do a lot of this stuff. You've got to have innovative technology, haven't you? So this is where the local supply chain can provide that, best in class sort of thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I suppose the question is also, what does local mean? How local is local?
Yeah.
We're talking West Coast in a scenario here, because as we've discussed, the scale and the numbers here are so significant. It's not going to be one size fits all at all. It's got to be a much broader piece.
I'm also, I'm discussions with members of the Celtic Sea Developers Alliance through that forum and informally. I think the indication is that these projects work best with assembly and manufacture as close to site as possible. Definitely O&M. Definitely O&M, and O&M for floating offshore wind, I think, as we've heard today, will, is going to require significant infrastructure and long-term benefits. So it's not, if we get it right, this helps drive the cost down, or should help drive the cost down for these projects, which is where we need to get to for cost of energy.
Tim?
Yeah, just, well, a quick perspective on that. First of all, I think the Crown Estate, we think that this local opportunity and supply chain capacity is extremely important. But I think as we sit here today and we look at the status quo, because the question is framed around supply chain plans and this kind of word, local content. And, BEIS has its approach to supply chain plans, and it's framed around, that issue. But actually, if we look at what's happening today and the prospect of Crown Estate leasing process and how could that operate in this environment, then it's fairly difficult to say what should the local content of a project that's going to be built in 10 years' time say. At the moment, particularly as we've acknowledged on the panel that the infrastructure, enabling infrastructure doesn't exist, and the supply chain offer isn't there, and to the point, developers don't know what they're going to build yet because they've got still a wide range of technologies to choose from. So I think at this early stage, for me, the collective focus should be on how can we enable investment that supports industrialization and innovation and reduces the carbon content of what gets built. And that's the right question for this stage rather than the local content question. And then if we collaborate to get that investment in the enabling infrastructure, if we focus on industrialization and innovation, we then have we don't have a contradictory goal of UK content being, higher price, because we're investing in the things that drive the cost down. And then you can ask a question about what's the local content later, when developers are clear what they're building and when a supply chain sort of offer exists. So I think that for me, a no regrets action would be a shared view from the community that exists around the Celtic Sea of what does a future blueprint for the supply chain look like? What does good look like? What can be genuinely competitive that the developers would be happy to buy from? And let's focus on channeling investment into that. and then we can get to the local content question when it's being created and when it's genuinely competitive.
If I can add up to that on the local content target, I think, I mean, in any case, the supply chain in Wales and the rest of the UK would tremendously benefit from ambition, and whether that has the form of a percentage of investment is to be discussed. I would tend to slightly disagree that there's such a thing as an obvious number for UK content target for FLOW at the moment. Just acknowledging the history that has been done on the bottom fixed industry and the industry collaboration around finding the numbers and the potential for UK content, assessing the bill of materials, understanding the cost breakdown, and actually putting numbers on what's feasible on bottom fixed, and landing on a target of 60%, but backed with a very thorough industrial analysis and baseline. I don't think at the moment this work has been done at industry level for floating wind just yet. There are lots of similar things in the bill of materials, floating wind farm versus bottom fixed, but a lot of things that differ as well. And where the supply chain strength in the UK cannot be inferred from works that have been done on bottom fixed. So definitely in favour of having high ambitions for floating wind as well, but I would not say that the number is so obvious and that we're getting close to find it just yet.
Okay, let's change tack a little. We talked about HRAs earlier, and there's a question here about overall consenting. And what do we as a panel consider to be the primary consenting issues for the industry in the Celtic Sea? Who's going to start now?
I'm happy to give you a general view, although I regret the fact that Jess, my colleague who specialises in this, has had to leave by now. You maybe wanted to say something, Louise, and I'm happy to.
Yeah, just a simple word, perhaps timing, and the timing to consenting. So we've submitted our consenting application for Airbus in December 2021. So hoping to get determination this year, and we're conscious that it's going to take some time to have this determination, and as the pipeline of project increases and the workload increases as well, this kind of timing could expand in the future rather than shrink and become more efficient. And just conscious that has a tremendous impact on the project timeline, so that's really our number one request, I would say, to have some swift determination periods that actually enable all the projects to progress at pace and contribute to the 2030 target.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'll agree with that. I think, you know, the situation as it stands is, again, it's we're putting a lot of risk onto the developer. So the developer needs to go and do their EIA, get their surveys, apply for their consents, go through that process, hopefully get consented, and then if they want to build another wind farm next door, do it all again from scratch, which I guess Louise is going to, that's what you guys are having to do with Valoris. So I think there is an opportunity, and by the way, the regulators, the NRW and MMO, you know, both feel that maybe isn't the most efficient way of tackling this. So there is an opportunity to think about this a little bit more holistically and strategically, and is there any way that we can, and I know this is something that Tim and the Crown Estate are looking at, sort of enabling surveys and data acquisition to really get ahead of the curve, get some of the sort of early stage baselining done, you know, understand the seabird environment for the Celtic Sea as a whole, could save significant time for developer consenting moving forward. So I think, yeah.
Just an addendum to that. I mean, let's not forget that the ports and developing the ports infrastructure is also going to involve some consenting challenges in terms of change of use, building the infrastructure, probably some dredging. There'll be various consenting challenges there as well.
Not the D word.
Yeah, exactly.
And coming back to you, Jim, in a moment, but this is a question about awareness and acceptance of risk. Comment here that Herima didn't have an order when they built the world's largest construction vessel, but they created a high-value market. And do we think that our ports potentially lack entrepreneurship? Are they too risk-averse to face this opportunity? Or is there sense in their positioning at the moment? Potential lack of confidence?
I don't know very much about the Harima situation, so I'm not sure I can answer this terribly well, apart from saying I haven't seen any lack of ambition in terms of an entrepreneurship from the ports, but there is, I think one of the guys we've been working with in one of the workshops described various valleys of death which face the ports in terms of the first valley of death is being able to get that consenting and that sort of high risk sort of finance in order to be able to do that. Is that just money that's lost and are you prepared to lose it? So, but the more significant one is that do you have to turn off your existing income streams in order to be able to build the infrastructure, and how long do you turn it off for? A second valley of death. And you need a reasonable amount of certainty that your pipeline is actually real in order to be able to enter that with confidence. So I don't think it's a lack of entrepreneurship. I think it's a genuine desire to be able to line up the things we've talked about, the supply chain, developers, and the grid, all of those. Those things are the complex system, which it's never going to be risk-free. But can you reduce those risks to an acceptable level?
I think you're right, Jim. Those ports have already got established businesses, and sort of established business as usual. They've got to protect that, and they've got to understand that if they're going to make some investment, how long is that for? And that sort of new infrastructure. How is that sustainable? Yeah,
exactly.
It's also fair to say that the time from conception of a ship through to delivery onto the spot market can be achieved in 3 years. So in terms of speculative investment, it is probably a much less riskier punt than building, port infrastructure could be worth $250 billion, which is going to be in place for, as you made, 120, 130 years. So,
okay.
So,
and in a similar vein, a comment here about the ports need that project work stream as an investment incentive. And we've talked about the 160 million support from BEIS. Is it true that only the government incentives can unlock this? Can we expect industry to step up alongside the government incentive? Is it a chicken and egg? Is industry going to wait for government incentive before it takes that step, or not?
It's about de-risking, isn't it? I think somebody made the point to me, and apologies if anybody in the port industry is here in the room, but somebody from the port industry made the point to me once. We don't have a problem with capital. We're owned by a port investment company. So in terms of investment capital, it's there. We're aware of other investment entities that are keen on infrastructure investment, but it is about making sure that the investment case stacks up. And I think, as we said earlier on, that it's that gap in timing at the moment, which is probably the issue. If somebody arrives and, if Louise says, here's a contract for 20 years of O&M, right, we know where we stand, that the investment case is sound, let's crack on with it. But Louise isn't going to be able to do that until she hits FID. And that, at which point, the port's not going to be able to react to that in time. So I think that's the conundrum. That's the kind of where we need to focus, but perhaps I think about how we de-risk that.
Okay.
It's almost anticipatory, isn't it? And,
yeah.
To be perfectly honest, we're still trying to work out exactly what that answer is. So we don't know yet. What is the role for Welsh Government? What is the role for UK Government?
Yeah. Right. Okay. I'm going to draw it to close there, and I'm going to draw it to close with an apology, first of all, as well. A complete faux pas on my part, in that we had a sponsor for this session. I should have made this comment at the beginning, and I apologise, but Of course, we've heard a lot from Louise and Blue Gem Wind and the Erebus project here, but as I mentioned, there are 18 other developers in the Celtic Sea Developers Alliance, and one such developer around the Gwent Glass project in the Celtic Sea is a cooperation between EDF Renewables and DP Energy in a joint venture. They have been very pleased to sponsor this particular session today and really see that the Celtic Sea opportunity is significant. The challenge is great, as we've just discussed. The prize is building a new industry, security of supply, sustainability, regeneration, investment, energy security, etc. The Gwent Glass team here and well represented in the exhibition. I hope you've been able to engage with them. You know, have similar project values to and commitment as we all do. And really, I'd like to thank them for their sponsorship for this session. And again, apologies that I didn't say that at the beginning. So, I would just like to say to our panel, thank you so much for a really engaging conversation. I think in an hour and a half, we've talked about 4 key elements. We could have talked for an hour and a half at least on each of those. We've skimmed the surface, and it's clear that there are going to be more events and more initiatives to develop the conversation, to help to develop the progress in the Celtic Sea over the coming years. We have a lot of work to do, which has become very apparent from the nature of this conversation. I do hope you've enjoyed it and found value in it. Thank you all for contributing through Slido. I apologise that we haven't been able to get through all the questions, but I hope you'll join me in thanking the panel.
Didn't need any prep at all. Just smash it.